I've been studying oil spills for over 35 years. And during this period of time, I've been trying to understand what happens to oil that's spilled in the environment, what are the environmental effects of oil spills, and more importantly to myself and my career, I have a keen interest in saying, what can we do to clean up oil spills should they occur to protect our marine environment? What I'm going to talk about today is oil spill science and a program that we have in Canada right now to look for alternative response measures. When we think about oil spills, I think most people now think about the Gulf of Mexico oil spill that occurred in 2010. Or for those of you who are here in Nova Scotia and can remember, back in 1970, we had the Arrow oil spill that occurred in Shuttlebuckto Bay, and it released over 10,000 tons of oil and contaminated 75 miles of shoreline in Nova Scotia. And of course, if you're reading the news the last 5 years, we hear all about oil spills that have occurred on the west coast of Canada as well as the east coast of Canada. There have been numerous small spills that have occurred that have caught a lot of media attention. The National Academy of Sciences, a number of years ago, looked at a calculation and said how much oil actually enters our ocean. And the calculation at the time in a report called Oil in the Sea, which will be updated next year again, they calculated at the time that there was 343 million gallons of oil that enter the oceans of the world every year. Take it in the context of an Olympic-sized swimming pool, 25 meters wide, 50 meters long, 2 meters deep. It's a lot of oil. We're actually talking about 560 Olympic-sized swimming pools. And if you put them end to end, we're talking about 28 kilometers of swimming. That's a lot of swimming and a lot of oil. So where do you think all of this oil that enters the marine environment comes from? A lot of people would think that, well, the oil obviously comes from spills because that's what we usually think about, tanker spills and things like that. But in reality, most of the oil actually comes from natural seepage. There's oil being released from the seabed naturally. It's oil that's just leaking through the seabed into the ocean. And in fact, of that oil that enters the ocean, approximately 46% is attributed just to natural seepage. 37% of the oil that enters the marine environment comes from operational discharges. This is from industrial developments, urban discharges from sewers and things like that. Only 12% of the oil spills account for the oil in terms of transportation, and 3% from extraction industries. This is a slide showing a submersible in the Baffin Island back in the early 80s when I was doing some research back then looking at natural seepage, and we were actually looking at the natural seepage of oil 600 meters deep in the bottom of the ocean off Baffin Island. There's a large oil slick there. It still exists today, and it's continuous release of oil. Not only that, we found natural seepages of oil off Nova Scotia and Georges Bank. And there are natural seepages of oil that occur in the North Sea. And also, as we all now know, there's natural seepage of oil that occurs in the Gulf of Mexico. So when people talk about seeing tar balls on the shores of the Gulf of Mexico, there are always tar balls on the Gulf of Mexico on the shoreline from natural seepage. So what happens to all the oil that's released into the environment? I tell people, well, you would think with all that oil entering the ocean every year, we'd be knee-deep in oil right now. So why aren't we? Well, scientists, we've been studying oil spills for a long time, and we're trying to understand what happens to the oil that's released into the environment. So as we all know, when you spill oil in the environment, they form oil slicks, and these oil slicks move along the surface of the water. Oil floats on water, we all know that. But immediately following a spill, there's a number of processes that occur that actually impact that oil. Some of the oil, actually a large amount of the oil when a spill occurs, will actually evaporate and go in the atmosphere. Some of the oil, because of that evaporation, become thicker and eventually form tar balls that you see on shorelines. Some of the oil may sink into the ocean. Some of the oil actually dissolves in seawater. Some components dissolve in seawater in a process called dissolution. But in the long term, what happens to that oil that's released into the ocean? Well, most of it is actually biodegraded by bacteria. So over time, in the long term, most of the oil that's been spilled in the ocean is actually biodegraded. In fact, if you ask the scientists now for a scientific consensus and said what happened to most of the oil that was released in the Gulf of Mexico during the oil spill, that oil has been biodegraded. Just to give you an idea of biodegradation, this is an image of an oil droplet over 35 hours, and I started the video at about 19 hours, but bacteria adapt to the oil. This is a droplet actually suspended in moving water. And so you can see bacteria growing on that oil droplet and being sloughed off. And it just shows you how much metabolism and bacteria are degrading that oil droplet in the water column. But of course, bacteria can't degrade all of the oil. There are some components, high molecular weight components in the oil that are highly persistent. And these are things like the asphaltene components, which is no different than asphalt that you find in the highway. So here's a photograph of oil from the Arrow oil spill off the coast of Nova Scotia at a site called Black Duck Cove. This was a cove where the oil came ashore. It wasn't cleaned. It was left as is. And if you go to that site today, you'll find mats of oil on the shoreline which look like pieces of asphalt. And this site is pretty well recovered. What you're looking at, Black Duck Cove today, is actually a small provincial park. So if the earth has been seeping oil into the environment for eons, and bacteria have adapted to degrading the oil, do we really need to do anything to clean up oil spills? So why do we need to advance oil spill cleanup if nature does such a great job? Well, the problem is the fact that when oil spills occur in accidents, we're releasing a lot of oil in the environment in a very small area. And nature just can't keep up with degrading that oil at such high concentrations so quickly. So what we need to do to protect our ecosystem and the living resources in the ecosystem is to help nature along. And that's why we look at oil spill countermeasures and look at what can we do actively to clean up oil spills in the environment. Some people think that, well, oil spills won't be a problem in the future anyway because we're going to go to renewable energy or other sources of energy. What they don't realize is to meet the world's energy demands, we'll be using oil for a long time yet. If we look at the International Energy Agency, they calculate that by the year 2040, we'll still be using oil to meet 27% of our energy demand that we need for the world. So we still have that risk of oil spills in Canada, and even more so today, because we're looking at moving oil along our coastlines. Obviously in Canada, we're looking at shipping oil, exporting it, as we all know, with the Trans Mountain Pipeline from the West Coast. So there's an increased risk of oil spills just because of the sheer amount of marine traffic. The offshore oil and gas industry is growing. That provides a small risk. And also just shipping traffic and even pleasure craft and everything else in the world is increasing. So the risk of oil spills is increasing in Canada. And we have one other thing in Canada, and that's the Canadian Arctic. As we all know right now, because of global climate change, the open water season in the Northwest Passage is getting longer every year. And of course, there's a lot of predictions that in the future we're going to be moving more marine traffic through the Arctic to save transportation costs. The other thing is in the Arctic, we also have the growth of communities, and we have the growth of industries in the Arctic, such as mining. All of these require the movement of fuel to support these communities and industries. And another thing that we're looking at, even greater, as we've seen in the last few years, we're starting to look at things like ecotourism in the Arctic. So there could be a lot more large ships going through the Arctic. When we're looking at oil spills, in terms of tankers, because typically when we're looking at the media, we think of oil spills and so-called catastrophic spills from tankers like Exxon Valdez. Since the 1970s, the number of oil spills from tankers have dropped dramatically around the world. And this is because we're now using new ships that are double-hulled. We have many more safety protocols from the International Maritime Organization to make sure that we have safer shipping in the waters around the world. But because of these other increased risks, we still need to enhance our capability and capacity to clean up oil spills. So what we need to do as a scientist is to optimize our scientific research efforts. And what can we do as scientists to support oil spill response? And why are we as scientists so important? Well, Benjamin Franklin said in the 1700s, an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. And when he came up with that line, he was really talking about firefighting in Philadelphia. But that holds true when we're talking about oil spills and preparedness and prevention. In Canada, we have a very strong oil spill response regime. So we have a number of protocols in place. We have a lot of things that are behind in terms of infrastructure to support us in terms of should an oil spill occur, we can do something about it. All of this to protect our living resources and our ecosystem around us in the ocean. However, when you have all these people making decisions in emergency situations, how do they make those decisions? Really, what you need is you need a lot of data, and you need it very quickly, and you need science behind it. So one of the things that we do as scientists is to provide the evidence that they need and the data to make the right decision when a spill occurs and what to do. So if you have all these scientists together, and we're looking at oil spills and conducting experiments, and we're trying to understand how to protect it better and protect the environment, what are we looking at? Well, one of the things that we have to know right away is, should an oil spill occur, what type of oil is it? In Canada, we can be looking at anything from light oils like condensate to heavy oils that we all hear about, diluted bitumen. And how you treat an oil or how an oil behaves varies with the chemistry of the oil. So should a spill occur, we need information on what type of oil is it. Second thing is, if we have oil on the water and it's been released, how much oil is spilled? We need to come up with technologies and methodologies to calculate how much oil is spilled so we know how much effort we need to clean up and how to better use our resources. And then if we know how much oil is spilled or the release rate, where is it going? And this requires a lot of science, the interaction between physical oceanographers and chemists, understanding waves, tides, currents, where things are going, and trying to understand what are the sensitive sites on shoreline should the oil come to shore, so we can actually put in preventive measures before the oil gets to that coastal shoreline. So we want to understand where's the oil going, what are the sites that could be impacted, and if we use different treatments, what's the difference? And then, of course, we have to understand the physical behavior of the oil. As I mentioned, when you spill oil in the environment, it can move all over the place, and it's changing all the time. So is the oil staying as a slick on the surface? Is the oil sinking? Is it forming droplets? Is it being dispersed? So we need a lot of analysis to understand what's going on with the oil so we can actually treat it or do something about it. And then, of course, a lot of people, and especially in the Maritimes, one of the first things we think about when an oil spill should occur is what's going on in terms of ecological effects. Or as fishermen would look at it is, what's going on with my livelihood in the future in terms of my fisheries that we need to protect. So we need to understand what are the ecological effects of oil spills, and should they occur, how long will it take before recovery really sets in and we feel that we're back to what we consider baseline conditions. And finally, if there's an oil spill, what can we do to clean up the oil spill? And that's what we're going to be talking a little bit more about today. What are the various options that we have to clean up oil spills? And even before and after we clean up an oil spill, one of the things that we want to do is to monitor and assess how much damage has occurred and what's the rate of recovery. We need this for compensation and for a number of other things to understand what is the consequence of the spill and who's going to pay for it and things like that. So the Arrow oil spill, as I mentioned, in Nova Scotia occurred back in 1970. And since that time, at that time, we actually started a large research program in fisheries and oceans studying oil spills. And DFO has never stopped studying oil spills since the Arrow oil spill. So we're looking at decades of research on oil spills around Canada. In 2013, the government of Canada actually announced a plan to support what we called a world-class oil spill response regime. How can we ensure that Canada has the best oil spill response methodologies and technologies that we can apply and the capacity to apply them should a spill occur. In 2016, the government announced the Oceans Protection Plan. This is a large research program to protect the marine environment, and it essentially funded over 50 programs within the federal government. Of these 50 programs, it consists of a number of areas that we want to cover. We want to ensure safe and secure marine shipping. We wanted to protect the marine environment. We wanted to engage Indigenous communities in protecting the environment. And in terms of science, we wanted to ensure that there was innovation and science supported, so we had the evidence to make decisions when required to protect the environment. And in 2015, I was honored to chair the Royal Society of Canada report on oil spill response and looking at fate and behavior of oil in the environment. And within that report, we actually identified over 400 recommendations that we could put in place to improve oil spill response capability in Canada with science. Under the Oceans Protection Plan, one of the 50 projects that we're looking at is what we call the Multi-Partner Research Initiative. And this was a research plan based largely on the recommendations of the Royal Society of Canada report, where we said, look, when we looked at case studies, one of the things that we understood is we need to make decisions. We need to make decisions quickly, and we need information. Right now, when a spill occurs, we're scrambling looking for that information. It could be in government, could be in academia, it could be in industry. So the idea was, how do we get the best people together and work in a network so we can provide that information as required and to enhance the science so we're not duplicating our efforts. And while we're at it, not only do it nationally, let's do it internationally. Oil spills are not a regional problem. Oil spills are a global problem. There are research institutes around the world conducting studies on oil spills. So why don't we work with them within this network and bring the best people together to work with us in Canada and for us with them. And not only that, in case of a large spill of national significance, we can bring in their assistance in a seamless manner to work together. So in Canada right now, the conventional way that we're cleaning up oil spills, and in fact, really the only legal way that we have to clean up oil spills, is by booming and skimming. And this is essentially, let's go and capture the oil and put it back in the bottle. So we're looking at deploying large booms, collecting the oil, and then using these devices that you see there called skimmers to pump that oil within the boom onto vessels and bring it back to shore. So that's the major method, the preferred method right now for cleaning up oil spills in Canada. It can be highly effective, but at the same time, it has a number of limitations. As you can imagine, if you have large storm events or large waves or high current situations, you can't maintain the integrity of a boom. So what we need are better tools beyond the convention of booming and skimming. So with the Multi-Partner Research Initiative, we thought, let's look at alternative response measures. So what are these response methods? These are methodologies, and some are accepted and used in other parts of the world. But right now in Canada, because of legislation, we can't apply them legally. So what we need is the science so we can actually make decisions of whether they're safe to use, and if they are, when do we use them in the environment? And that's what the MPRI program has decided to focus on. So what are these alternative response measures? One of them is what we call spill treating agents, or STAs. These are chemicals that we can add to an oil spill that change its behavior to make it easier to clean up an oil spill. The one that you hear a lot about the news when we're talking about spill treating agents is chemical oil dispersants. I'm sure you've heard a lot about it because of the Gulf of Mexico oil spill, because they applied chemical oil dispersants not only by ship on the surface, but they also applied it subsurface where the oil was being released. Well, what are chemical dispersants? Chemical oil dispersants are really no different than your dishwashing detergent. They're soaps. And what they do is they break up the oil into small droplets, and those drops of oil move from the surface slick into the water column. The advantage is it protects seabirds, and it reduces the amount of oil that could come to shore. And of course, a lot of people would think about chemical oil dispersers and say, well, really, let's think about it. You're just hiding that oil. You're just brushing it under the carpet now and moving that oil from the surface into the water column. What people don't realize is the premise behind using chemical oil dispersants. The idea is to break up that oil into very small droplets that's then diluted to such low concentrations that there's no toxic effect. The second thing is, when you break up oil into small droplets, bacteria can degrade the oil much quicker, because bacteria can only attack oil at the oil-water interface. So by increasing the surface of the area of the oil by putting it into small droplets, the oil is actually broken down much more quickly by natural bacteria. Another technique that people talk about, and it's been tested in Canada and the Arctic, is burning oil. So people think, well, if you have a large oil spill on the surface of the ocean, why don't we just take a match to it? Well, one of the things, as you see in some of these photographs, oil doesn't burn very effectively on water, and it creates a lot of black smoke. And so there are always environmental concerns about that, but we can reduce a lot of oil. The other thing is, to burn oil, it's not that simple. If an oil slick is spreading, it spreads so the oil is so thin that the water below it cools down the oil and you can't ignite it. So the only way that you can burn oil at sea is to actually boom that oil to get it thick enough so you can ignite the oil. And then, of course, you're running into the same limitations as booming and skimming, the integrity of the boom. The other technology that we're looking at under MPRI is, let's forget about the oil boom. Let's use chemicals as a boom. So there are chemical compounds, which are called herders, and you can see a little video clip here where we can spread these chemicals around an oil slick and actually moves the oil slick and gets it thicker. And then we can ignite the oil and burn it without a boom. And that's the technology we're looking at evaluating. Oil translocation, moving oil from one area to another. This is a process that we're trying to study, trying to understand oil translocation when oil is spilled on the shoreline. So what happens to oil that reaches our shorelines, the intertidal coastal areas of Canada? How can we help clean the oil, or what occurs naturally? So we want to have a better understanding of the interactions between oil and fine mineral particles, or applying things like surf washing agents, chemical agents, to help clean the oil off the shoreline that'll move the oil into the water where we can collect it by booming and skimming. So oil translocation is an area of research that we're conducting to clean shorelines that are contaminated by oil. And then, of course, we can always improve what we're already doing. We talked about booming and skimming. One of the problems in booming and skimming is when a skimmer is collecting that oil from the boom, it's not collecting just oil. It can collect a lot of water along with it, and some of that oil may also be emulsified, so it's a combination of oil and water mixed. It's almost the consistency of molasses. So it's no different than trying to collect a large volume of mayonnaise with oil mixed with water. And we all know that oil floats on water, so how can we try to separate that oil from the water at sea when we're collecting it from skimmers? And if we can do that, and we can find a reliable way of safely disposing of that contaminated water back at sea rather than bringing it on shore, we would increase the efficiency of booming and skimming. Now, one of the things that we talked about is bacteria, and of course I'm a microbiologist, so it's always an interest. But one of the things we have to understand is, and I keep reminding people, there's no single technology for oil spill cleanup that's 100% effective, despite what people think. Every manufacturer, everybody has their favorite way of cleaning spills. They think, we can clean it, it's a non-issue. There's no technique that's 100% effective. So what happens to the oil that we don't clean up and that's left in the environment? So there we're going back to understanding what happens to microbes and the other processes like photooxidation, evaporation, dissolution. And this process we call natural attenuation or natural recovery. So we want to conduct studies to understand at what rate should an oil spill actually recover, say if an oil spill occurred off the coast of Newfoundland or on the west coast or even in the Arctic. And people, when I talk about oil spills in the Arctic, they think bacteria degrading in the Arctic, it's cold. That oil is not going to biodegrade. You know, we all think about putting food in the refrigerator and it doesn't break down. But bacteria in the environment are adapted to the environment. They're used to the environment they're in. They're used to oil in the environment, as I mentioned, from natural seepage. We now find, doing DNA analysis, that we can even see oil degradation for oil that's frozen in ice cores from the Arctic. So yes, oil can degrade in the Arctic. In the Gulf of Mexico oil spill, at 1,500 meters deep, the water is almost zero, and oil biodegradation rates were occurring just as quickly at those depths in the Gulf of Mexico as it was in mid-water locations. So we're doing a lot of research trying to understand natural attenuation and the process. And then there are all those other issues. As I mentioned, the Royal Society of Canada report gave a recommendation for 400 areas of research, and I'm only talking about alternative response measures or 4 or 5 technologies. But in reality, research in those technologies support research across the board. To give you an example, if we're going to clean up an oil spill by chemical oil dispersants or in situ burning or anything else, we have to know where the oil is. To do that, we're conducting research on things like use of autonomous vehicles so we can track oil spills in the environment. Where is the oil when it's spilled? If we're using various treatment technologies, what's going on with that oil? So we have a research program on the use of autonomous vehicles to track oil spills. As I mentioned, there's always a question of toxicity. When we talk about chemical oil dispersants, the first thing people talk about is, well, what about the toxicity of those chemical oil dispersants? So we have a large research program that's coordinated within the MPRI program for every one of those technologies to look at toxicity. Because as a secondary effect, we could increase toxicity in the environment or we could reduce it, and we want to know. So there's a large research program on toxicity. And the same for chemical analysis. One of the things that we're doing is coordinating chemical analysis using standardized techniques across the country and between countries, so we can actually compare scientific results to make conclusions about the efficiency of oil spill response methodologies and their effects. For all of this, we actually have a process. There's an established process in the oil spill response regime called net benefit analysis. And this is a framework that we use to make decisions, and it's based on scientific data. So the question is, when a spill occurs, what is nature doing on its own? If we decide to use a countermeasure to help clean up an oil spill, what's the effect of that countermeasure? Is there an advantage over what nature can do on its own? And, as I mentioned, when spills occur, the environment and the oil is changing. So the countermeasures that you're going to use may change over time. So net benefit analysis is something that is ongoing right from preparation before a spill occurs, and it continues throughout an oil spill. We're always looking at updating data that we collect to decide on what option are we going to use to clean up the spill. And in fact, really it's not what option, it's what options are we going to use in the mixture that we have on hand that we can use to optimize the cleanup of the oil spill and protect the environment. So what have I learned over 35 years of oil spill research? We've learned a lot in the 35 years. Since the Arrow oil spill, and here you can see they were sampling from a dory back in the 1970s to what we do today, we have a much better understanding of what happens to oil in the environment. We now understand the importance of microbes. We understand the various technologies that we can try to apply. In order to choose what technology we're going to use, one of the things that we really I now understand is every oil spill is different. Fighting oil spills is not like fighting a fire where you say, look, I'm going to take, it's an oil spill or an electrical fire, and I'm going to take fire extinguisher A or fire extinguisher B. The environment is constantly changing. The oil that's spilled can be different from one region to another. We have to make decisions. Those decisions are based on science. And what we do in science is to provide that data so we can make the right decisions to combat oil spills, to protect the environment that we all live in and value. So I thank you for your interest, and if you have any questions, I'll be glad to answer them.